Welcome to Doing the Work, a Naples Integrated Recovery podcast. My name is Brian, and this space is for anyone who's tired of surviving the same emotional and behavioral loops, whether that's anxiety, trauma, addiction, or problems in your relationships. Around here, we cut the surface level advice and sugarcoating, no platitudes or bumper sticker wisdom. We focus on clarity, responsibility, emotional discipline, and the courage to look at yourself honestly so that you can stop repeating old patterns and start living with intention instead of reaction. Let's get into it. Have you ever noticed what happens when you offer someone feedback? Not padded praise with reassurance, not just checking in, or those cute little emails from HR like gentle reminder blank, but an actual observation that implies something needs to change. Well, if we're being honest, something shifts immediately. Posture tightens, breath changes, people stop listening and start organizing a response, often not thoughtfully, strategically. You notice that you're not walking into a conversation, you walk into defensive posture. What's important is this: they aren't protecting the behavior that you named, they are protecting the identity underneath it. That's the part that people miss, and it's why feedback collapses predictably. Often we say that we want growth, that we value honesty, we claim we want people to tell us the truth. Then, the moment that the truth threatens the story that we are telling about who we are, the system locks down. Explanations appear, context floods the room, exceptions line up, and it's not about us lying or being weak, it's the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do: preserve coherence in the self. This is not a character defect. And I feel like I'm saying that on nearly every podcast because some of that moral language from 12-step programs and self-help related stuff or spirituality moralizes stuff that is really truly a survival pattern. The brain doesn't experience feedback as neutral information. It doesn't. It experiences it as a threat assessment, especially when feedback carries the implication you are not as competent, kind, present, or reliable as you think you are. That's where our defensiveness lives. And you can see it in how quickly we justify ourselves. I was late because the traffic was just absolutely insane on Collier Boulevard. There's geezers everywhere. Or I didn't reach out because I've just been so overwhelmed. Or I would have helped more if I wasn't already so depleted and exhausted from how much I have on my plate. The speed matters. There's no pause, no checking in with the content. The explanation arrives before it's even fully formed. And that is not reflection, it's a reflex in our nervous system. What's being defended isn't the excuse, it's the self-image that's behind it. Most people treat who they are and what is good as the same thing, not as belief, but as built-in mental shortcuts. The system in the brain that tracks self-relevance and value are tightly linked. Because of that, feedback does not register as neutral information. When someone suggests change, the brain doesn't process it as data about our behavior, it processes it as a negative judgment about the self. And once that happens, defensiveness isn't even a choice, it's just an automatic response. The brain doesn't hear, "This is information," it hears, "Something about you is wrong." And once that translation happens, learning shuts down. This is why feedback between partners, colleagues, friends, and even in therapeutic settings, it can derail quickly. One person thinks that they are addressing or talking about behavior, and the other person experiences it as a verdict about their character. Two different conversations happening in the same room, each person is convinced that the other is missing the point. And here is a simple but costly example. One partner says, "I wish that you were more present in the evenings." On paper, this is a concrete request about time and attention. Put your phone down. In the listener's nervous system, it sounds something else like, "Okay, got it. I'm a bad partner. I'm failing. I'm not enough for you. Why don't I just move back to Cape Coral?" Right? And once that meaning attaches, the conversation is no longer about evenings and being present. It's about identity. And identity doesn't negotiate calmly, it defends territory. This is where people dig in. They might argue details. They might cite intentions. They list everything that they're already doing. "Oh, really? So I was a bad partner when I used to do A, B, and C?" They start to defend every square inch of who they already are, instead of just taking a moment to ask who they might become. This is the truth. Many of the people who are most defensively sincere believe that they are already committed to growth. And I'm calling myself out here. We read the books, we listen to the Naples Integrated Recovery podcast, can use therapy language, talk about insight and self-awareness, but confuse wanting to see themselves as someone who grows with someone who is open to change. They are not the same thing. Wanting to be good is not the same as tolerating disruption. Growth requires destabilization. Even modest improvement involves letting go of a version of you that you felt was sufficient. The brain resists this, not because we hate growth, but because that uncertainty feels dangerous. There's bias in how the brain manages value over time. It prioritizes immediate coherence over long-term benefit. So in plain terms, it would much rather protect your current identity than risk short-term discomfort for future gain. And that is why defensiveness feels so urgent. It's trying to close that nervous system loop as fast as possible. This also explains why people respond better to feedback they generate themselves rather than feedback that is offered by somebody else unsolicited. When the idea arises internally, it feels like agency. When it comes from the outside, it feels like a judgment, even if it's accurate or well-intentioned. So here's something that we don't like to admit. Most of the time, we don't actually want feedback. What many of us want is confirmation that we are already doing enough given how hard life already is. We want effort acknowledged more than we want our blind spots exposed. That doesn't make us dishonest. It makes us human. But it does mean that blunt honesty, delivered without psychological skill, often functions as relational arson. So what do we do with this? First, we stop pretending defensiveness is about ego or stubbornness alone. It's about identity threat. And if you don't account for that, then you'll keep having the same conversation with different people and wondering why nothing changes. Second, we start tracking our own reactions in real time. The moment that you feel internal surge of, "This isn't fair," or "They don't see everything that's on my plate or what I'm juggling," or "They're wrong about me," that's the moment that really matters. You don't agree or submit, but just pause. Defensiveness always arrives before insight, and if you miss it, then you miss the window. Ask a different question than, "Are they right?" but instead ask, "What part of me feels under threat right now?" competence, loyalty, being seen as a good worker, husband, being indispensable, that answer matters more than the feedback content itself. Third, learn to separate behavior from identity. This sounds simple and it feels unnatural. The brain fuses these two things automatically, but growth depends on decoupling them. You can be a caring partner who still needs to change the way that you show up at night. You can still be competent and slow to respond. You can have good intention, but still miss bids for connection. If every suggestion for change feels like an attack on who you are, you will eventually train the people around you to stop telling you the truth. And that doesn't create peace, it creates stagnation. Finally, we start treating defensiveness as just information. It tells you where your self-concept is rigid, where your worth feels conditional, where improvement threatens something that you are clinging to. Those are not failures, they are not character defects, they're edges of where you're at currently. And edges are where growth actually happens. So, have a sip of coffee, and I'm going to move into this next section about change not requiring you to erase yourself, but to build capacity, because a lot of people don't have much. If defensiveness is the nervous system protecting identity, the next question is practical. How do you lower the threat without lying to yourself, collapsing into compliance, or letting people walk all over you? The answer most people reach for is confidence. To be more secure or grounded or certain of who you are. And that instinct is understandable, but also wrong. A rigid sense of self doesn't absorb feedback, it deflects it. The stronger and more tightly defended identity, the less room there is for new information. What actually reduces defensiveness is not fortifying self, but creating distance from it. And distance doesn't mean disengagement. It doesn't mean detachment or dissociation. It means loosening the reflexive, they're attacking me, or this is about me, frame enough for the nervous system to just stand down for a moment and for the mind to evaluate. When that happens, feedback stops feeling like an attack and can start becoming functional data. There's a simple way to see this at work. Notice how clearly you can evaluate someone else's behavior compared to your own. If a friend is drinking too much, for example, or if they're procrastinating, or if they are repeating the same relational mistake, you can usually see the pattern without much effort. You can talk about trade-offs, consequences, long-term costs, and you don't need to defend their identity. You're not invested in preserving that image. This is also one of the reasons why it's easy for me to see a bunch of clients and to tell them what I am observing and probably what they might need to change. Ultimately, it's up to them. But I can do that with some distance because I don't feel under attack with that. It's just neutral information. But when it's you, everything is complicated. The context multiplies, exceptions stack up, the story becomes noisy, the behavior disappears underneath explanations. Same brain, different frame. This is why one of the most effective questions for reducing defensiveness is also one of the most underused. What would you tell someone else in this situation? This question works because it temporarily relocates the problem outside of your identity. You're no longer defending who you are, you're evaluating behavior, and that shift alone can drop defensiveness dramatically. The same principles show up in perspective taking. When people imagine how a situation looks from someone else's point of view, Emotional reactivity decreases and judgment improves, not because they have become nicer, but because identity isn't on the line the same way. The brain has some room to breathe and to reason. Mindfulness, in functional form, operates with the same mechanism. Not lo-fi jazz and slogans on the walls, but a useful version that is just noticing an internal reaction without obeying it. You feel the surge of defensiveness, that urge to explain and to want to be understood, but then instead of acting, you just observe it. That pause matters more than people recognize. Defensiveness feeds on speed, and the faster you justify yourself, the safer identity feels. Slowing down interrupts that loop. It gives your nervous system time to settle and gives options besides counterattack or withdrawal. That doesn't mean that the feedback is always right. Some feedback is sloppy, some is self-serving, some is delivered very poorly or unkindly or with an agenda. You creating that distance doesn't mean you're submitting to it. It enables your own discernment. You cannot tolerate feedback if you're busy defending against it. Another distinction that helps here that is often overlooked is the difference between core traits and peripheral ones. People are generally open to changing traits that they don't experience as central to who they are. Organization, punctuality, communication, these usually land without a ton of resistance. But when feedback is interpreted as a commentary on core traits like your kindness or competence, loyalty, or worth, of course, defensiveness is going to spike. The problem is that many people automatically translate behavioral feedback into a character judgment. So, something that is just data, like you don't call much, we filter to got it, so I'm a bad friend. Or, hey, you've seemed distracted at night, gets filtered to got it, I'm a bad partner. And once that translation happens, learning stops. One way to interrupt this pattern is internal reframing before responding. Not softening the message or pretending that things are fine, but simply locating it accurately. Ask yourself, is this actually about my character? Or did they say something about logistics, habits, timing, energy, and attention? Most feedback is in the second category, but we drag it into the first. Values affirmation works through a related channel. When people reconnect with what is genuinely mattering to them, the sense of self can stabilize. That security makes imperfection tolerable. So here's the important part. When your worth is not hanging on, being flawless in this specific domain, you can afford change. People with fragile or narrow sources of worth often appear confident, but react intensely when they are critiqued. They need every domain to confirm that they are okay. But people with broader sources of meaning can absorb feedback because no single behavior defines them. This is where purpose really matters. Not your ambition or achievement, but purpose. Especially purpose that extends beyond your own self-maintenance, because when life is oriented towards something larger than protecting your own identity, feedback can just be a tool. It's not a verdict or a judgment about you. Look at the pattern across all of this. Every effective strategy for reducing defensiveness either shrinks self or it expands self. Shrinking the self means loosening identification, seeing your thoughts and reactions as events rather than truths. Expanding self means remembering that you are larger than this moment and larger than this critique or this flaw. What doesn't work is armoring self. That just hardens the shell. There's one more factor that really reliably lowers defensiveness, and often we don't even know we're doing it. Story. When information is delivered as a story rather than a directive, people lower their guard. They stop evaluating and they start tracking. They aren't deciding whether or not they agree, they're watching what unfolds. That's why stories bypass resistance so effectively. It's also why people can recognize truth in movies, novels, and anecdotes that they reject outright in a conversation, because story creates distance. Nobody's telling you what to do. You're just observing the consequences of what happened in this story or with this person's movie or whatever. This matters for how you receive feedback as much as how much you give it. Because if you hear feedback as a story about a pattern over time rather than a judgment of who you are, openness lasts longer. And openness is the real currency here. Not agreement, not compliance, openness. Most people don't need harsher feedback. They need conditions where feedback can actually land without triggering their identity collapse. So the next time that you feel a reflex to defend, try something different. Don't argue, don't agree, don't explain. Ask one question. If this wasn't about me, what would I notice? That question creates enough space for learning to come into the picture. If defensiveness shrinks when identity loosens, the final question is this: what actually makes identity flexible? Not fragile, not vague, flexible. Most people hear that question and assume the answer is ego reduction. Be less attached. Care less about yourself. Don't take things so personally. That advice sounds wise, you know? There's tons of books that are written about that, but it usually fails. People don't become less defensive by trying to disappear. They become less defensive when self is large enough that any single critique doesn't threaten survival. Defensiveness thrives when self is small. A small self has narrow load-bearing walls. A few traits carry too much weight. Being competent, being kind, being reliable, being the good person at AA. And when feedback hits one of those pillars, the whole structure shakes. Of course, the nervous system reacts. Collapse feels close. A larger self distributes the weight differently. When meaning, connection, purpose, and values extend beyond a single role or trait, feedback loses its catastrophic quality. It still matters, it still stings, but it doesn't feel like an existential threat. The system doesn't have to mobilize so hard to protect itself. This is why people often become less defensive after genuinely destabilizing experiences. Not because trauma magically produces wisdom, but because narrow identities break under pressure. And when life strips away all those familiar roles or illusions of control, then people are forced to rebuild self that isn't dependent on being right, impressive, or approved of in every interaction or circumstance. That rebuilding is very uncomfortable and clarifying. Think about how different feedback feels depending on how much everything else is holding you up. If your sense of worth is tied to one domain, then critique feels intolerable. But when your life has multiple anchors, the same critique becomes pretty workable. This is also why people who are deeply connected to something outside of themselves tend to be easier to give feedback to. So parents who are grounded in values rather than performance, or craftspeople committed to mastery rather than their image, people who are oriented towards service, responsibility, or contribution rather than self-presentation. It's not that their ego is gone, it's contextualized. Meaning plays a central role here. Not meaning as inspiration, but meaning as orientation. When you know what you're aimed at, feedback becomes directional. It helps you correct course. And if you don't, feedback feels random and personal, feels like a judgment because there's no larger framework to place it in. This is where people get stuck. They want feedback to feel safe before they commit to something meaningful. In reality, it works the other way around. Commitment stabilizes the self. Stability makes feedback tolerable. Connection works similarly. People who feel securely connected can tolerate more friction. People who feel relationally precarious experience feedback as a threat to their belonging. When attachment feels uncertain, criticism can feel very dangerous, and then your nervous system is going to react accordingly. This is why feedback inside of relationships can often trigger disproportionate reactions. It's rarely about the content, it's about the fear underneath. If this is true, then what does it mean about how you see me, and what does it mean about whether or not I'm safe here? When the relationship can hold tension without withdrawal or retaliation, then defensiveness can decrease, not because people stop caring, but because the nervous system learns that critique does not mean abandonment. It's another factor that reduces defensiveness and often does not get discussed. Competence built through action. People who are actually engaged in skill building tend to be more open to correction than people who primarily identify with being competent. And that difference matters because when your identity is built on doing the work rather than being seen as good at doing the work, then feedback just is part of the process. This is obvious in physical domains. Athletes expect correction. Musicians expect critique. Craftspeople expect refinement. The identity isn't I'm good, it is I'm a work in progress or I'm practicing. That frame makes feedback useful rather than threatening. And in many psychological and relational domains, people skip this step. They adopt the identity of being insightful or evolved without staying grounded in the practice of change. Feedback then feels like an accusation instead of an instruction. Another contributor to flexibility is familiarity with failure that doesn't destroy you. People who have survived being wrong, disappointing someone, or falling short without losing their footing develop a different relationship to feedback. They know that the nervous system recovers. The threat signal quiets down faster. But people who have been protected from failure or who learned early that mistakes carry disproportionate consequences tend to react a lot more intensely. Their nervous system learned that getting it wrong was dangerous. Defensiveness makes sense in that context. This is not about blame, it's about pattern recognition. So, where does this leave the practical question of receiving feedback in real time? Well, it leaves you with the responsibility for building a sense of self that can tolerate friction, not through denial, but through expansion, through relationships that can hold tension, through action that produces real competence, through meaning that isn't contingent on always being right. When the sense of self is large enough, ego doesn't need to dominate the room. And that brings us to the final misconception worth dismantling, the idea that growth requires ego elimination. It doesn't, but it does require ego regulation. The ego becomes a problem when it's unchecked, when it interprets every challenge as a referendum on worth. A regulated ego knows when to step forward and when to step aside. It can listen without collapsing, and it can respond without defending reflexively. That capacity is not a personality trait. It's a skill that's built over time, tested under pressure, and refined through experience. If you find yourself consistently defensive, the answer is not to shame that reaction or to try to suppress it. It's to ask yourself a harder question. How small is my self right now? Where am I asking one trait, one role, one relationship to carry too much weight? And where am I clinging to coherence because I don't trust that I can tolerate disruption? Those questions point towards work that actually changes something. Feedback will never feel completely neutral. It will always activate something, and that's normal. The goal is not for you to be emotionally flat. The goal is flexibility, the ability to stay present long enough to learn before the system closes ranks. And when that happens, feedback stops being something that you survive, and it instead starts being something that you use. And that's the difference between talking about growth and actually doing the work. Thanks for spending the time with me. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with somebody who may need to hear it. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others around you. Remember that we're all doing the best that we can with the tools that we currently have, and we are all capable of growing past them. If you'd like to reach out or connect, send me an email, brian@naplesintegratedrecovery.com. I hope to hear from you there. And in the meantime, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.